In this video, we're going to learn about the role of natural selection in evolution. Natural selection is a process where only those organisms that have the capability to adapt to their environmental conditions can survive and reproduce to give more offspring. The concept of natural selection was proposed by two naturalists, Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace Russell. There are many factors that can drive evolution. However, natural selection is the primary driver of evolution. Evolution can be considered as changes that happen in populations over time, and these changes occur due to changes in the genetic composition or the genotypes of the individuals present in the population. For example, if we looked at an ancestral finch, which is a type of bird, then depending on the environmental pressures, like the availability of food, they could have changes in their genetic composition that allowed certain populations to have certain types of beaks. And this created different types of finches, where we had one type of finch that had a beak that was good for eating insects, while there was another one that had a different type of beak to bore into wood to find the insect. And finally, there was another population that evolved that had beaks that were good for eating seeds. This way, environmental pressures through the process of natural selection allows populations to evolve. There are certain criteria that have to be fulfilled for natural selection to occur. One such criteria is that in the population, there must be genetic variation. For example, when we look at this population of giraffes, we should have some giraffes that are taller than others. And this is because of the differences in the genes present in these giraffes. Not only should there be genetic variation in the population, this genetic variation should be transmissible to successive generations. And what that means in a sense is that as these giraffes reproduce to give rise to progeny, the progeny that are formed should also have varying heights that allows for genetic variation to be sustained in the population. Genetic variation is important because it allows organisms to adapt differently when there are changes in the environment. Another criteria that has to be fulfilled is that the genetic variation in the population must lead to differences among the individuals of the population in lifetime reproductive success. For example, the giraffes that are taller have the ability to gain food more easily from those that are shorter. This increases their likelihoods of being healthier and stronger and able to mate more successfully to give rise to offspring. And thus, we're able to see that within this population, there are some individuals that are able to give rise to more progeny or progeny that have better survival, in this instance if they are taller, if the conditions are going to change, like if a drought arises, which causes a decrease in the foliage that is present in the environment. Alfred Russel Wallace and Charles Darwin studied different animals around the world and based on their observations proposed the concept of natural selection. In the case of Darwin, in addition to different types of organisms, he extensively studied the beaks of finches that were present in the Galapagos Islands. He found that the beaks of the finches corresponded to the type of food that they ate. For example, warbler finches are known to eat insects, and their beaks are small and narrow. However, ground finches are known to eat seeds, and so to crush the seeds, they tend to have larger, powerful beaks. Charles Darwin documented his observations on the beaks of different finches extensively, and this served as an inspiration to Peter and Rosemary Grant, who also studied the beaks of a species of finches called as Geospiza fortis in an island from 1973 onwards. They observed that there were different populations of these species that were present on the island, and their beaks were slightly different from one another. They found that when there was ample rain present on the island, there was an abundance of small tender seeds that were available, and small beaks were good enough to break open these seeds. On the other hand, when there was scarce rainfall or if there was drought in the island, these smaller seeds were not as abundant, and hence there were more large seeds available. In order to feed on these larger seeds, the beaks had to be larger and more powerful in order to break these seeds open. The Grants studied the beaks of these finches on the island over many years. In order to study beaks, scientists can measure the length of a beak or the depth of a beak. The Grants quantified the depth of the beak during the different years, and the more depth that is there in a beak, the more powerful is the beak. The Grants hypothesized that during wet years, there will be birds with less beak depth that are more prevalent, and hence that population will be in a majority compared to those that are going to have a higher beak depth. This is due to the fact that there will be more smaller and tender seeds, and hence there is no pressure to have more beak depth. On the other hand, during the dry years, the birds with more beak depth will become prevalent because there will be a scarcity of small tender seeds in the environment. The Grants found that during the dry years, where rainfall was scarce, the average beak depth of the population increased. This was because there were more birds who had a higher beak depth, and this was due to the fact that there were more larger seeds that they could feed on more efficiently than the birds with the small beak depth. By being able to feed on the larger seeds more effectively, these birds with the higher beak depth were able to survive better and mate to give rise to more progeny than those birds that had a small beak depth. On the other hand, during the wet years, there was an abundance of smaller seeds that the birds with the less beak depth that could feast on. And this resulted in their ability to survive and reproduce to produce progeny, and thus the average beak depth of the population was reduced compared to the time when there was a drought. The Grants further observed that the beak depth was inherited by offspring, and hence those parents that had a lesser beak depth gave rise to offspring that also had a less beak depth. Similarly, parents that had more beak depth gave rise to offspring that had more beak depth. Thus, the Grants were able to show how changes in the environmental conditions drove the evolution of these finches through the process of natural selection. Natural changes that occur in the environment can drive natural selection. But in addition to those natural changes, human activity can also drive natural selection. We're going to look at the tail of the peppered moth and see how industrial pollution was able to affect the population of the peppered moth. In England before the 1850s, in a forest, scientists had found that the bark of the trees were lighter in color. In these forests, the peppered moth was present, and the peppered moth had organisms that were darker in color, while some of those that were lighter in color. When the Industrial Revolution occurred and more industries started growing in the vicinity, pollution caused by this industry caused a change in the color of the tree trunks where they became darker in color. What was found is that before the 1850s, when the tree bark was lighter in color, there were more lighter colored moths present than the darker version. However, after the tree trunks became darker because of industrial pollution, there was a change in the population of the pepper moths, where now we could see more darker moths surviving than the lighter colored ones. Bernard Kettlewell performed an experiment where he released equal numbers of dark and light moths into polluted as well as non-polluted woods. After a period of time, he captured the moths in both places and counted how many he retrieved. He found that in the polluted woods, where the wood was darker or the tree trunks were darker in color, he was able to retrieve more dark moths that were able to camouflage with the tree bark than the lighter colored moths. On the other hand, in the non-polluted woods, he was able to retrieve more lighter moths because they were able to blend in better with the lighter bark of the trees than the dark moths. He also filmed birds to see which moths they preferred to eat and noticed that the birds were able to capture those moths that could not blend in as well in their surroundings. Thus, we have observed, as environmental conditions change, natural selection can favor certain traits. We have also observed that the opposite trait can be favored when there are once again certain changes in conditions. In the case of the pepper moth, it was found that as more and more restrictions on pollution were put in place, there was lesser and lesser pollution observed. And as the pollution levels dropped, the tree colors started to change back to their natural color, and so did the pepper moth population, where now we were able to see more prevalence of lighter colored moths than the darker colored ones. There are different types of natural selection, and the first one that we're going to look at is disruptive selection. Let us take the example of the tail of a squirrel, and let us imagine that there is an original population where we have a range of lengths of tails among the different squirrels. Now, there is a change that occurs in the environment, and this change allows the selection of squirrels either that have very short tails because it helps keeps predators from catching them and hence they survive better, or the ones that have long tails because they're very good for balance in the trees and hence they're able to escape from their predators by being able to jump on trees and navigate through the trees fairly efficiently. However, those squirrels with the middle tails are being caught by predators more effectively and hence their population is going to decrease. Another type of selection is directional selection. Let us take the example of a population of lizards who have varying tail lengths. If there is a predator that comes into the environment of these lizards, and if that predator is scared of snakes, then we can imagine a scenario where that predator will be scared of the lizards that have a long tail because the tail resembles a snake. So the longer the tail it is, the more scared the predator is going to be to attack that lizard. And hence, those lizards with really long tails are going to have a survival advantage. And hence, the population of lizards is going to shift towards having more abundance of lizards with longer tails. And hence, there is a movement in one direction of the extreme. And it is against the other extreme, which is having a short tail in this example. Another type of selection is a stabilizing selection. Let us take an example of a cat's tail. And in this case, it turns out that you can have a population of cats that have varying tail lengths. However, there is a certain selection pressure that comes in that allows the tail of medium length to be selected for. And hence cats that have a medium length of tail are the ones that are going to survive the best. Hence, those that have short tails and those that have long tails are at a survival disadvantage, and hence the selection of cats with medium tail length are the ones that are selected for. Another type of selection is oscillating selection. Let us look at the example of the beak depth of finches. When there are abundant small seeds available due to ample rainfall, the population's average beak depth is on the lower level. However, during drought time, when there is scarcity of these small tender seeds, we can see that there are more individuals in the population with a higher beak depth. However, once again, when conditions change and we have more rainfall that allows more small seeds to be present, we're now able to see that the population changes again, and now we have more individuals with a small beak depth. And thus, we are able to see changes in traits going back and forth depending on environmental conditions. Thus, there is a direct correlation between the ability of an organism to adapt and its survival. There is a famous quote where it is said that it is not the strongest of the species that survives, not the most intelligent that survives. It is the one that is most adaptable to change. This brings us to the phrase survival of the fittest. This was a phrase coined by Herbert Spencer, and it implies that natural selection, or selection in general, will favor organisms that are not only able to survive, but can also produce more offspring. And hence, we use the term fitness to show the ability of an organism to produce offspring. The fitness of an organism is dependent on the survival of the organism, its mating success, and the number of offsprings that are produced per mating. For centuries, humans have imposed selection in certain plants and animals through a process called artificial selection. Plants and animals that showed favorable phenotypic traits were bred for many generations so that their genes that provided those favorable phenotypic traits were passed on to future generations. This way, we were able to create plants or animals that were more beneficial to us. Let's take the example of corn. All corn came from the wild ancestor called as teosinte. When we look at the kernels generated in the plant teosinte, they're a lot smaller than modern-day corn and fewer in number. Through interbreeding certain varieties of teosinte, we were able to generate plants that showed more kernels, and the kernels start becoming larger, until today where we can see that modern corn looks quite different than teosinte. Modern corn is able to have kernels that are larger than the ones observed in teosinte, and also there are many, many more. This way, we are able to use one corn plant to feed more number of people than what was possible with teosinte. There are also unintended consequences of human actions, for example, the growth in antimicrobial resistance in bacteria. Antibiotics are compounds that are commonly used for treating bacterial infections. However, due to the rampant use of antibiotics, there is an increase in antimicrobial resistance. If you try to see why this happens, then it's important to know that in the environment, there's usually a mixture of normal bacteria and other bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics. When antibiotics are used, they kill all the normal bacteria that don't have any resistance, and that allows the resistant bacteria to proliferate, and now they are more in numbers. This creates an exponential increase in antimicrobial resistance simply because there are more bacteria that are able to counter the effects of the antibiotic. Now, what is scary is that these resistant bacteria can also go ahead and transfer the antibiotic resistance genes to other types of bacteria, which allow them to now go ahead and become antibiotic resistant. With this, we come to the end of our talk where we learned about natural selection and its role in evolution. We looked at examples of natural selection in action and learned about the concept of survival of the fittest. We also saw different types of natural selection and how humans have used artificial selection in order to get plants and animals that are more beneficial to them.